Welcome to Wednesday night Bible study. It's September the 27th, 2023. Now, I was just noticing the date, and that's exactly 3 months from this day. I'll be turning a year older, and those numbers are really piling up. That first number is getting high. But we're here, and the Lord's blessed us with one more time, and so we're going to work together. And we've been in Genesis for a while. We've been looking at the life of Abraham, and we are reaching some goals that have to come true for the covenant that God made with Abraham. Actually, God made it with himself, but through Abraham, of a nation that would be a great nation. It would have great numbers, and it would be a blessing to the whole world. And of course, Abraham and Sarah did not have a child. They're in their old age, and the Lord has not only given Abraham the covenant and said, your descendants will be many, but he's reaffirmed that in our study through a few chapters, and but yet we've not seen a child born in the womb of Sarah. So today we're looking at chapter 18, and this is going to get us a little closer to the birth of the true promised child, that is the child from the womb of Sarah, Abraham's wife. I kind of contemplated as to whether to read this chapter or not, and I think I am. It's a fairly long chapter, and my information and my study is not all of that long today, so maybe we can get it in a kind of a precise timing here, a reasonable timing. So if you've got Genesis 18, you can follow with me, and I hope that you have, and we'll move through this. Beginning in verse 1, the Lord appeared again to Abraham near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. "My Lord," he said, "if it pleases you, stop here for a while. Rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. And since you've honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey." "All right," they said, "do as you have said." So Abraham ran back to the tent and said to Sarah, "Hurry, get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough, and bake some bread." Then Abraham ran out to the herd and chose a tender calf and gave it to his servant, who quickly prepared it. When the food was ready, Abraham took some yogurt and milk and the roasted meat, and he served it to the men. As they ate, Abraham waited on them in the shade of the trees. "Where's Sarah, your wife?" the visitors asked. "She's inside the tent," Abram replied. Then said one of them, "I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son." So here we have another kind of confirmation again of that descendant that has to be the descendant of Abraham, the promised child through the womb of Sarah. And so now we narrow it down to about a year from where we are tonight. So Sarah was listening to the conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, "How could a worn-out woman like me enjoy the pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also old?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, 'Can an old woman like me have a baby?' Is there anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. But the Lord said, no, you did laugh. Then the men got up from their meal and looked out toward Sodom. As they left, Abraham went with them to send them on their way. Should I hide my plans from Abraham, the Lord asked? For Abraham will certainly become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. I have singled him out so that he will direct his sons and their families to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. Then I will do for Abraham all that I have promised. So the Lord told Abraham, I have heard a great outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah because of their sin, and their sin is so flagrant. I am going down to see if their actions are as wicked as I have heard. If not, I want to know. The other men turned and headed toward Sodom, but the Lord remained with Abraham. Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away both the righteous and the wicked? Suppose that you find 50 righteous living there in the city. Will you still sweep it away and not spare it for their sakes? Surely you wouldn't do such a thing, destroying the righteous along with the wicked, while you would be treating the righteous and the wicked exactly the same. Surely you wouldn't do that. Surely not the judge of all the earth. Surely not the judge of all the earth do what is right. Well, you understand where Abraham is now. He's concerned about Lot. Lot's his nephew, remember, who pitched his tent towards Sodom. And he's concerned about Lot. And so he's asking the Lord, if there is some righteous people in Sodom, would he spare the city? In verse 26, the Lord replied, if I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the entire city for their sake. Then Abraham spoke again, since I have begun, let me speak further to my Lord, even though I am but dust and ashes. Suppose there are only 45 righteous people rather than 50. Will you destroy the whole city for a lack of 5? And the Lord said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 righteous people there. Then Abram pressed his request further. Suppose there are only 40. Then the Lord replied, I will not destroy it for the sake of the 40. Please don't be angry, my Lord, Abraham pleaded. Let me speak. Suppose only 30 righteous people are found. The Lord replied, I will not destroy it if I find 30. Then Abraham replied, since I have dared to speak to the Lord, let me continue. Suppose there are only 20. And the Lord replied, then I will not destroy it for the sake of the 20. Finally, Abraham said, Lord, please don't be angry with me if I speak one more time. Suppose only 10 are found there. And the Lord replied, then I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. When the Lord had finished his conversation with Abraham, he went on his way, and Abraham returned to his tent. In this chapter, we find it opening with the appearing again of the Lord to Abraham. Now, his name has changed. Chapter 17 is a game changer, a name changer chapter. So Abram has gone to Abraham again, the father of many nations. So in that 17th chapter, the Lord shows up to Abraham, and he tells him that he is El Shaddai, the mighty God. And he says to him, serve me faithfully and live blameless before me, and I will make a covenant with you. He's reaffirming that covenant he made back in chapter 12, by which I will guarantee to give you countless descendants. Now, let me back up to chapter 17 and just read these for our memory, just refresh our memory a moment. In verses 4 through 8 of chapter 17, the Lord speaking said, I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you from generation to generation. In other words, he says, I'm going to refresh this covenant to your offspring and to their offspring. This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. And I will give you the entire land of Canaan, where you now live as a foreigner, to you and to your descendants. It will be their possession forever, and I will be their God. So the Lord told Abraham, it's your responsibility and the responsibility of your descendants to keep the covenant. And the covenant was, as we looked in that, again, the seal of that was that each male among you must be circumcised. Now, Abraham believed the Lord, and that very same day, Abraham carried out the terms of the covenant. Not only he was circumcised, but Ishmael, his son by Sarah's servant, Hagar, was circumcised, and all the men that were there were circumcised. Abraham did that immediately. He obeyed immediately. He didn't wait to obey the Lord to a more convenient time, but he was obedient. And real faith acts quickly to the truth and in obedience to the command of the Lord. So we put our faith to work through obedience to the Lord. And when is the time for that? Well, we learned from Abraham, the time is now. If we believe the Lord, if we trust the Lord, if it's his word and we trust that, then immediately we become obedient to it. And by the way, since we're moving into chapter 18, Abraham is 99 years old at this time. Now, in our chapter today, the Lord appears to Abraham again near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. Now, Mamre is a place. It is a place that is kind of identified with Abraham for a while. In chapter 13, you remember Abraham went to Egypt and he comes back and he comes back to Mamre in verse 18 of chapter 13 of Genesis. So Abraham moved his camp to Hebron and settled near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. There he built another altar to the Lord. Now, that's after Abram comes back, and he's Abram then from Egypt. Now, in Genesis chapter 23, so listen to me if you're not going to move and follow that. In Genesis 23, verses 17 through 19, we see how Mamre is identified with Abraham. It reads, so Abraham bought a plot of land belonging to Ephron at Machpelah, near Mamre. This included the field itself, the cave that was in it, and all the surrounding trees. It was transferred to Abraham as his permanent possession in the presence of the Hittite elders at the city gate. Then Abraham buried his wife Sarah there in Canaan, in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, which is also called Hebron. So that was in Genesis 23. Today we were in chapter 18. So we've got a while to go before Sarah dies. Now in Genesis 25, verse 9, it reads, his sons, Isaac and Ishmael. So we know that we're talking about Abraham. He had the promised son, Isaac, and then he had the son by Sarah's maid, Hagar, Ishmael. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar, the Hittite. And then if we move on to Genesis 49, verses 29 and 30, then Jacob, remember Jacob, Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. This is Jacob. Then Jacob instructed them, Soon I will die and join my ancestors. Bury me with my father, who is Isaac, and grandfather, who is Abraham, in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite. So there's Jacob's request to be buried there. Now, Genesis 50, verse 12 and 13. So the sons of Jacob did as he had commanded them. They carried his body to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre. Now, this is the cave that Abraham had bought for a permanent burial site from Ephron the Hittite. So we've got a little identity of Mamre, Hebron, also known as Hebron, and it becomes what Abraham had in the land of Canaan, what he had in the promised land, and that was a burial site for Sarah, for his wife, and then we see even Jacob gives instructions, and we see the carry out of the instructions of being buried in that cave there in the oak grove at Mamre. Now, when we look at chapter 18, I read some of Warren Wiersbe's commentary, and as I looked at that and read what he had to say, along with several other commentaries about this chapter, I decided I wanted to use his outlines. I want to give him credit for this. That is the topics, and there are 4 of them, I think. And the first one is Abraham's communion with Christ. So we'll follow that. And I'm not going to go back and to reread all of the scripture. So you'll have to listen closely here and then think about this. But in chapter 18, we find Abraham sitting at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. Well, remember, the tent identifies him as what he was, a pilgrim. And sitting at the door of the tent had two meanings, I think, that we could understand. One was it was the hottest part of the day and the heat of the day. And so in the open door of the tent, it was much cooler. If there was any breeze, he could feel that. And I don't know whether you've ever camped and done any tent camping. I haven't since I've gotten grown, but I was in the Boy Scouts way back, and I went to summer camp, Boy Scout camp in the summer several times. And of course, you slept in tents, 2 bunks in a tent, and you slept there. If you went up there to sit down or rest or anything else during the day, it was hot as blue blazes in June or July. And you would have to almost be at the front of the tent and even trying to have your head to stick out beyond the tent cover, so you might feel a little bit of breeze. So Abraham was sitting probably the coolest part of the tent there in the heat of the day. Now, it was custom for the Easterners to receive guests, whether their friend that came was a friend, or even if it was an enemy, they were to receive them. And if an enemy rode up and dismounted his ride, and if he touched the rope of the tent, then he would be received as a guest. Now, you remember in Romans, we get the instructions, if the enemy is hungry, feed him. So sharing a meal was a way of making a covenant peace or restoring a broken covenant. So it revolved around a meal. And I'm thinking that they must have been Baptist, because we can do a lot of things around the table that's got sliced ham and potato salad on it. We can get a lot done. And in those days, the meal, again, was a peace offering. It was a meal. It was kind of the covenant of peace, or it was of restoring maybe a broken covenant. Just like sharing salt with them was a peace or a restoring gesture because salt is a healer. And eating bread, breaking bread together was special too. It was not to be cut, but it was to be broken. Cutting the bread was considered cutting life itself. So we kind of understand what's going on there. The custom of that was, again, to the friendship around a meal. Even today, Bedouins, that's those who are herders or shepherds of sheep or goats. Again, they keep a pot of coffee on the fire 24 hours a day, just in the event of that a guest should come. And you may think, well, that would be wonderful in the wide open and the green pastures and all of that. But you may not want to drink so much of that, or you may not even want to take the invitation if you're there, because they don't add coffee as it boils down. They just add water. And if it's been setting for a long time, then that coffee is going to be, like some people say, it's strong enough to walk off, and it's very bitter. And as they serve that bitter coffee, they say to their guests, life is filled with times of bitterness. Now, just before the guests will leave, they will offer to serve them a sweet tasting tea and say life also has times of sweetness and pleasure. So the guests leave if they're willing to accept the tea. If they drink that, then they leave with a good taste in their mouth. Now, Abraham does as custom. He welcomes these men, offers to serve them a meal that will be prepared by Sarah and her servants. Now, one of the three men, of course, we recognize in the text as we read all of that, is the Lord himself. It is Christ, the pre-incarnate Christ. It is the Christ of the Old Testament. And we even hear the words from Abraham again as he speaks to him and says to him, Lord. And we also remember that when they got ready to leave, that the two, they looked toward Sodom, and the two went their way, but the one, the Lord, stayed back to talk to Abraham. Now, Paul wrote in Ephesians 3:17, then the Christ will make his home in your heart as you trust in him. Your root will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. So Christ should be a welcome guest. As I picture Abraham and those men showing up, the Lord and two angels, then Abraham was ready to welcome them into his house. That should say something to us. The Lord maybe knocking on our door. You remember in Revelation, we see him in the time of fellowship. Behold, I stand at the door and knock, not a salvation passage, a fellowship passage. If you'll open the door, I'll come in and sup with you and you with me. Well, I wonder if the Lord knocks on our door today, how much cleaning up we would want to do before he came in. We may be moving all kinds of things around that he might, that we don't want him to see. But Paul, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, said, Christ will make his home in your heart as you trust him. Your faith will welcome him in, and your roots will grow deep down into the love of God, and he will keep you strong. How great to have the presence of Christ within us. And we know he is because the Holy Spirit indwells us as believers. Now, the second thing that I want us to look at, of I think 4, is Sarah's confession. You find that in verse 9 through 11. And again, we're not about 9 through 15, and we're not going to read this. But one of the men asked, where is Sarah, your wife? And Abraham says, well, she's busy with the details of her day. And one of the three says this: I will be back in about a year when Sarah has her son. Now, Sarah was somewhere doing, again, her chores, whatever it might be. And she heard this statement, and she laughed a laugh of unbelief. Abraham had laughed earlier. We saw that in the same kind of setting about having a son. But the words of Sarah giving a birth when he heard that was a laugh of faith and a laugh of agreement. But this one was a lack of doubt, was a lack of unbelief. But the response of one of the three was this: is there anything too hard for God? In other words, do you don't think that God can overcome the obstacle that you are too old in normal physical realm to have a baby? Is there really anything too hard for God? Well, Isaac's name actually means to laugh. And interesting how these things all tie together. Again, Sarah laughs. They named the baby Isaac. They were instructed to do that. It means laugh. And Sarah did laugh at the birth of her son. Genesis chapter 21, verse 6 and 7. And Sarah declared, God has brought me laughter. All who heard about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby? Yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age. So the laugh of doubt, the laugh of mistrust changes to a laugh of faith and a laugh of rejoicing when that promised child becomes a reality in their life. Now, the third thing is Christ's confidence in Abraham. Because the Lord stays back with Abraham after the two leave to head towards Sodom. And in verse 16 through 22, the Lord reveals his plans to Abraham. He tells him that he has heard of the wickedness and that he is going to see for himself. And again, he is planning destruction. And so the question that Abraham asked was, how could God destroy the wicked and righteous together? Abraham asked the Lord if he would spare Sodom if he could find 50 righteous people, and the Lord agreed. He said he would. Then Abraham began to kind of bargain with the Lord. I think he may have known that was a very ungodly place. So he says to the Lord, well, what if I subtract 10 from that? What if I move down to 40? And then on down to 30, and then on down to 20, and then one last time to 10. So the Lord says, if I can find 10 righteous people in Sodom, I will not destroy the place. Now, Abraham prays for Sodom. And in that, we learn to pray for sinners. Abraham was praying for that town. He had family ties. Sure, Lot was there, and his wife was there, and their children were there. And so he was concerned about them. And he was looking after them, the great concern that he had. But he was praying for the city or the town of Sodom. And we remember James teaches us that the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. And he takes us back to the prophet Elijah, where Elijah prayed for it not to rain. It didn't rain. Then he prayed for it to rain, and it did rain. Again, the effectual, fervent prayer. The effectual, fervent means working prayer. And the working prayer of a righteous man works. That's what that verse says in James. Now, Abraham failed in his request for Sodom, but we know the outcome of that as we read it, and we've known it for a while. We've known the story a long time, probably from Sunday school and as very small children. and Lot was spared. Now, an interesting fact in closing, Lot had at least 2 married daughters. In Genesis 19, it reads, so Lot rushed out to tell his daughters, fiancés, quick, get out of the city. The Lord is about to destroy it. So Lot runs when he gets the message from the angels. We'll talk about it next week. He runs to tell the fiancés of his daughters to get out of the city and get out of it quick. God's going to destroy it. But the young man only thought he was joking. Now, Lot had 2 single daughters. In Genesis 19, verse 30, afterwards, Lot left Zoar because he was afraid of the people there, and he went to live in a cave in the mountains with his 2 daughters. So if we count up, Lot and his wife, that's 2. 2 daughters and their fiancés, that's 4, that's 6. 2 single daughters, that's 8. And perhaps if the Christianity of Lot, if the faith, the God-given faith that Lot believed in the Lord had touched any of the lives of any of his neighbors or acquaintances, only 2 would have had to have accepted the Lord, trusted the Lord, and it would be spared. But it failed. And the only ones we can count up are those, and that was 8 possibilities if Lot's family had been saved. And of course, we know again that when Lot left, as we read in verse 30 of chapter 19, our next week's study, they went to live in a cave in the mountains. It was himself and his 2 daughters. So we're getting close to the fulfillment of the covenant. We're getting close to the beginning of descendants of Abraham. We're going to learn of the birth of Isaac, and then we're going to go far enough, study far enough to see again God testing the faith of Abraham again and telling him to take his son up into the mountain and to offer him as a sacrifice. So Abraham was a common man. He had his warts and his problems and all of that like the rest of us. He was not perfect. We're not perfect, but we can be forgiven. Christ came to take away our sin, and Abraham believed God, and God counted that to him as righteousness, a godly righteousness acceptable by God himself. And not because Abraham earned it, not because he deserved it, not because he lived perfectly from the day that the Lord came and met him and gave him this commandment and told him what he was going to do. No, it wasn't in perfection. It was in imperfection, but God worked through the imperfection, the sin, the mistakes, the troubles and the trials of Abraham, again, to bring about the very truth, produce the prophecy and the truth of what he had promised. And that was that Abraham would have many descendants, that Abraham would be the father of many nations, many, many people, descendants of Abraham. But we want to remember one more thing in closing. Paul made it clear. He said, now the true Jew is not the one who is just in the lineage of Abraham, physically bloodline, but the true Jew is like Abraham, who believes and trusts the very words of God. Well, what about you? Do you trust the words of God? How much of Abraham do you have in you to hear the word of the Lord, calling us to obey, and then by our faith, immediately shaping our lives in obedience to that truth? We often plan to do it tomorrow. We kind of treat sometimes the word of the Lord and obedience to the Lord like we do a diet. We need to go on a diet, need to lose some weight. And tomorrow's the best day to do that, because when we get to tomorrow, then that becomes today. So we put it off again till tomorrow. We don't want to be that kind of way, spiritually speaking. We want to trust the Lord. And by our faith, we want to be strong in the Lord and to overcome the temptations of life that displease God. Well, Abraham's quite a feller. He is really quite a feller. He's a normal feller. We see a lot of Abraham in us. Matter of fact, in all of God's kind of chosen out men, even the Jews themselves, when they gather in the temple to worship, then they have a kind of a repetitive thing they say about Jonah. You remember Jonah who ran away from the Lord, and they repeat, there's a lot of Jonah in each of us. And that's true too for us. Well, may the Lord bless you and take care of you. Hope to see you Sunday, 9:30 Sunday school, and then again at 10:30 for worship service.